Harlem, 1933. The afternoon sun baked 125th Street as a dozen of Dutch Schultz's toughest hitmen marched into the heart of Harlem. Shoppers and shopkeepers scattered for cover. In the middle of the block stood Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, calmly adjusting the brim of his fedora. He had heard the warnings that Schultz, the notorious beer baron of the Bronx, was sending his best men to eliminate him. Now they were here in broad daylight, armed to the teeth and confident in their numbers. Bumpy was outnumbered 12-1. People peered from doorways and behind cars, holding their breath. Harlem had seen gangland killings before, but nothing like this brazen show of force at high noon. The gunmen fanned out, some drawing pistols and Thompson submachine guns, their faces set in determination. At their head was a hulking enforcer with a scar down his cheek, one of Schultz's top lieutenants rumored to have 20 kills to his name. "This is your only chance, boy," the scarred man snarled, leveling a shotgun at Bumpy. "Dutch wants Harlem, and he wants your head on a platter." Another thug spat on the sidewalk. "Time's up, Johnson. Say goodbye." Bumpy's heart pounded, but his face showed no fear. He had survived knife fights in back alleys, gun battles in speakeasies, and 4 years in Sing Sing prison. He wasn't about to run now, not from Harlem, not from anyone. With steady hands, Bumpy reached into his coat as if to surrender a weapon, then snick. He flicked open his favorite weapon, a gleaming straight razor. The crowd gasped. A razor against guns. It seemed like madness. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't alone. In a flash, 2 of his own men appeared on the rooftops overlooking the street, rifles trained. They were the insurance he had arranged earlier, anticipating Dutch's move. In one booming crack, the rooftop sniper felled a gunman on the edge of the group. Chaos erupted. The remaining hitmen opened fire wildly, bullets thudding into brick walls and shattered glass. Bumpy sprang forward with startling speed, closing the distance before the nearest shooter could aim. He slashed viciously with the razor once, twice, and the man's trigger hand fell limp, tendons severed. A second would-be assassin lunged at Bumpy, but caught a lightning-fast blade across his throat. Gunfire roared from above and from Bumpy's right as his hidden allies joined the fray. Within seconds, 3 of Schultz's crew were down. The rest scrambled for cover behind parked cars and a fruit stand, firing at the rooftops. Pedestrians screamed and ducked into doorways. In the pandemonium, Bumpy rolled behind a steel trash bin, drawing a snub-nosed revolver from his ankle holster. A burst of Tommy gunfire stitched across the street, punching holes in a brick wall inches from Bumpy's head. He waited for the brief pause when the gun's magazine emptied, and then popped up to return fire. One of Schultz's men cried out and collapsed, clutching his chest. What was supposed to be a quick execution had turned into a small war on the streets of Harlem. The gunfight raged for 90 minutes, spilling into alleyways and up fire escapes. One by one, Schultz's best men fell. Bumpy's crew was surgical and relentless hit and run tactics honed from months of guerrilla war against intruders. 2 thugs attempting to flank the building found themselves ambushed in an alley by Bumpy's lookout, their bodies later discovered crumpled beside garbage cans. Another tried to take hostages in a barber shop, hoping to flush Bumpy out. But the Harlem residents inside wrestled him to the ground themselves, unwilling to be pawns for outside gangsters. This was their neighborhood, and they were fed up with Dutch Schultz's terror. At last, only one of the 12 hitmen remained alive. Trembling and bleeding from a grazing gunshot, he stumbled out onto the street amid the carnage. Broken glass and spent shell casings glittered in the afternoon light. 11 of his comrades lay dead or dying. Bumpy stepped over one body, razor in one hand and smoking revolver in the other. The survivor dropped his weapon, his bravado extinguished by pure terror. Bumpy grabbed the man by the collar and yanked him close, eyes blazing. "Go back to Dutch," Bumpy said in a low, lethal voice. "Tell him Harlem ain't for sale. I don't care how many men he sends, this neighborhood will never belong to him." The message was unmistakable. This single scarred blood, spattered thug would be spared not out of mercy, but as a human telegram to Arthur Dutch Schultz. Word of the broad daylight showdown spread like wildfire through Harlem that evening. Dutch Schultz, a mob boss, said to have personally ordered dozens of murders, went pale when he heard the outcome. The man who had terrorized New York with bullets and bombs had just lost nearly a dozen of his best henchmen in one afternoon, defeated by a black gang leader with a razor and a code of defiance. Bumpy Johnson's stand was already becoming legend on the streets, but to truly understand how Harlem reached this bloody turning point, we need to step back and see how the war between Dutch Schultz and Bumpy Johnson began. It was a battle rooted in real events of the early 1930s, a clash over money, power, and respect that would engulf Manhattan's most famous black neighborhood. The roots of a Harlem gang war in the early 1930s, Harlem was a community under pressure. The Great Depression hit black neighborhoods like Harlem harder than most. By 1932, unemployment in Harlem skyrocketed and families struggled to pay rent. The hope and glamour of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s had given way to breadlines and uncertainty. Yet even in these hard times, one enterprise thrived: the numbers racket. The numbers game, an illegal daily lottery also known as policy, was more than just a gamble. It was a financial lifeline and communal pastime for many Harlemites. For pennies or nickels, domestics, porters, and janitors could place bets hoping to win a windfall. By the late 1920s, the numbers racket had seized Harlem, like a form of madness, as one observer put it. On every block, runners quietly took bets, and winners were paid in cash, no questions asked. At the top of Harlem's numbers world reigned a smart, fearless woman, Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madame Satin, Claire, or the numbers queen. A French-speaking immigrant from the Caribbean, St. Clair had built a betting empire that made her rich and respected, and occasionally feared. She employed dozens of runners and controllers, and reportedly grossed thousands of dollars a week in an era when a laborer might earn 20. By 1930, St. Clair's personal fortune was rumored around $500,000, perhaps $8 million today. Her success challenged the notion that only men, and white men at that, could dominate organized crime. She was bold, profane, and unafraid to stand up to anyone, including the New York police. When corrupt cops harassed her or brutalized Harlemites, she took out ads in newspapers to publicly shame them and even testified to investigators about police graft. It was said that Madame St. Clair had a fierce temper and would curse out rivals in multiple languages if needed. Working side by side with St. Clair was a young prodigy who would soon become vital to Harlem's defense, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was a feared and admired figure in equal measure. Born in South Carolina in 1905, he'd come north as a teenager after his brother was nearly lynched for killing a white man. The Harlem streets had hardened him. By age 30, he'd spent almost half his life in prison. But prison also educated Bumpy. He was book smart, devouring literature, history, and philosophy behind bars. He emerged in 1932 with the polish of a gentleman and the cunning of a gangster. Bumpy got his nickname from a noticeable bump on the back of his head, but it also fit his habit of bumping back against anyone who disrespected him or his community. As an enforcer and lieutenant for Stephanie St. Clair, he earned a reputation for extraordinary nerve and toughness. If a landlord tried to evict a struggling black family, Bumpy would show up and pay the rent on the spot, no questions asked. When opportunistic thugs from other neighborhoods ventured into Harlem to shake down black businesses, Bumpy sent them back in ambulances, as people whispered, meaning he beat them so badly they'd have to be carried out. To many in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was more than a criminal. He was seen as a protector. He had a dual nature, philanthropic to neighbors yet ruthless to enemies. One contemporary later recalled that Bumpy became known as the Robin Hood of Harlem, sponsoring school tuition for children and covering rents for families facing eviction. He threw legendary block parties and gave away turkeys on Thanksgiving. But he also carried a handgun and a razor, ready to use both. In his own words, he was not afraid to shoot or be shot, as long as Harlem benefited. Meanwhile, downtown and in the Bronx, another underworld figure's star was rising, one on a collision course with the Harlem bosses. His name was Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz. Schultz was a stocky, volatile Jewish mobster who had carved out a bloody empire during Prohibition. Nicknamed the Beer Baron of the Bronx, he controlled bootlegging and speakeasies uptown and garnered a reputation for terrifying violence. It was said Dutch would kill a man for the slightest insult. In the late 1920s, he fought gang wars against rivals like Jack Legs Diamond, leaving a trail of bodies in New York. By 1931, at just 30 years old, Dutch Schultz had more than 100 gunmen under his command and was considered one of the top gang leaders in the city. He had powerful friends on his payroll, two notably: James Jimmy Hines, a corrupt Tammany Hall politician who effectively controlled the NYPD in parts of Manhattan. With Hines's protection, Schultz operated with near impunity. Even when federal prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey targeted him as public enemy No. 1, Dutch managed to beat a tax evasion case in 1935 by intimidating jurors and moving his trial to a friendly small town. As Prohibition ended in 1933, gangsters like Schultz looked for new income streams to replace bootlegging. Their gaze turned to the numbers racket, especially in Harlem, where policy betting was raking in tens of millions a year collectively. To big-time mobsters, It was an untapped gold mine run mostly by black amateurs who lacked Mafia muscle. Schultz saw Harlem's numbers game as ripe for the taking, and he was not one to ask nicely. According to accounts, Dutch sent word to the independent numbers bankers of Harlem, hand over control or pay tribute. He gave black and Latino policy operators two options: essentially relinquish their business entirely or continue running it only if they paid him a hefty cut of the profits. If anyone resisted, the consequences would be dire. True to form, Schultz prepared to back his ultimatum with brute force. Those who didn't play ball would pay the price in blood, noted one chronicler of the time. In late 1931 and into 1932, the squeeze on Harlem began. Schultz convened a meeting with his cronies and associates to discuss strategy for taking over the numbers rackets. Among those at the table was an attorney named Richard Dixie Davis, a dapper mob lawyer who had stumbled upon Harlem's secret wealth while working as a public defender. Davis knew from court cases how lucrative the policy game was and how most bankers avoided violence. To Schultz, this meant the bankers were suckers, lacking the guns and gumption to withstand a coordinated assault. With Davis's insider knowledge and Jimmy Hines's political clout greasing the way, Schultz's syndicate moved on Harlem like an army invading enemy territory. The takeover started quietly enough with extortion and buyouts. Schultz's men approached some small bankers, offering protection in exchange for a cut of their profits. Those who agreed got a temporary peace. Those who refused found their storefronts vandalized and their lives threatened. In one early case, two successful Harlem bankers, Wilfred Brunder and Henry Miro, decided the game was getting too dangerous. They sold off their operations to a local newcomer, thinking to cash out, but the buyer, a timid man named Joe Spasm Eisen, was immediately leaned on by Schultz's crew. As feared, Eisen couldn't withstand the pressure. Within weeks he was paying $1,000 a week to Schultz for protection, effectively handing over 2/3 of his business to the mob. It was a tried and true underworld tactic: take over from within by making the victim pay you until you own him. Then fate dealt a dramatic stroke that played right into Schultz's hands. On Thanksgiving Day 1932, a quirk of luck bankrupted many of Harlem's numbers bankers simultaneously. That day, a common superstition led thousands of Harlemites to bet on the combination 257, and against all odds, 257 hit. The payouts were enormous. Nearly every policy bank in Harlem was wiped out, unable to cover the winnings. Suddenly, the once flush bankers were desperate for cash to pay winners. Dutch Schultz stepped in with a wolfish grin, offering to bail them out on the condition that he took control of their operations. Banker after banker, humbled by financial ruin and terrified of violence, submitted. Schultz acquired stakes in bank after bank for pennies on the dollar, and by the end of 1932 was claiming a large share of Harlem's numbers racket without having fired a single shot. Not everyone gave in. A few independent bankers tried to hold firm. One was a young, ambitious man named Martin Fish Harris, who had earlier rebuffed Stephanie St. Clair's attempts to form a united front against the mob. Harris believed he could weather the storm alone, but he gravely underestimated Dutch Schultz's ruthlessness. On a Tuesday morning in early 1933, 3 of Schultz's gunmen kicked down the door of Harris's Harlem apartment. Inside, they found Harris with his girlfriend. The thug's pistol whipped the woman unconscious to make a point, then shot Harris to death in cold blood. They rifled his pockets for cash, netting a mere $5,000, and left his bloodied body as a message to anyone who might resist. The murder of Martin Harris sent shockwaves through Harlem. Harris had been well liked and was not known to be violent or won the game of gang wars. The community now saw plainly that Schultz was willing to assassinate even small-timers to scare the rest. A local black newspaper, the New York Age, grimly predicted what was coming. Harlem will be the scene of a long, drawn-out gang war, it warned, waged on one side by white racketeers, determined to continue their domination of the rich takings of the game, and on the other side by the Negro bankers who are working hard to exist and to win back the game which they once controlled. The stage was set for a bloody conflict. All eyes turned to Madame Stephanie St. Clair. Would she be next? By now, St. Clair's once formidable numbers empire was under siege. Many of her former allies were fleeing the business or flipping allegiance to Schultz. She was, as one account put it, running out of allies, options and power, and even her employees and customers were being poached or terrorized by the invaders. But true to her fearless persona, St. Clair did not back down an inch, at least not publicly. After Harris's murder, she penned a fiery letter that ran in the Amsterdam News, a leading black newspaper. Dismissing rumors that Harris died for associating with her, St. Clair defiantly wrote. "I assure you that had he been affiliated with me in any way, he would never have come to such an untimely and ill-fated end. The gang which killed Harris knows better than to molest me or my associates." It was a bold piece of bravado, essentially taunting Schultz's thugs that they didn't dare touch her. In reality, St. Clair was furious and alarmed. She now went about Harlem with armed bodyguards and rarely slept in the same location 2 nights in a row. It was in this climate that Bumpy Johnson truly entered the fray. Bumpy had been imprisoned on a burglary charge and got released in 1932, returning to Harlem to find his mentor Stephanie St. Clair under siege. He promptly offered his services to Madame Queen. Bumpy had always admired St. Clair's audacity. She, in turn, trusted Bumpy's combination of brains and brutality. She knew she needed soldiers now, not just ledger clerks and lawyers. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson became St. Clair's war chief, a role that would test every ounce of his ingenuity and courage. On St. Clair's orders and funded by what remained of her bankroll, Bumpy began recruiting a small army for hit and run operations against Schultz's far larger force. If Dutch wanted a war, Bumpy was going to give him one Harlem style. To understand Bumpy's strategy, it's important to grasp the asymmetry of the fight. Dutch Schultz commanded dozens of gunmen, with resources and police contacts that extended beyond Harlem. Bumpy could not match him man for man in open combat. Instead, Bumpy adopted guerrilla tactics. He organized his most trusted friends, many of them fellow ex-convicts and toughs from the neighborhood, into small cells that would hit and hide. They struck quickly and disappeared before Schultz's men could respond. And unlike Schultz's usual Italian and Irish adversaries downtown, Bumpy and his crew knew every alley, every back staircase, every blind turn of Harlem streets. This was their home turf. Soon, Schultz's foot soldiers started encountering deadly surprises. One night, 2 white gangsters showed up in a Harlem speakeasy, throwing their weight around and boasting that Schultz runs this town now. They never made it home. The next morning their bodies were found in Mount Morris Park, a quiet green square in the center of Harlem, beaten, stabbed, and with bullets in their heads. The message was gruesomely clear, and it wasn't an isolated incident. Over the weeks that followed, the corpses of more of Schultz's men turned up periodically in Harlem streets and alleyways, often left in public view as a warning. Some were dumped at dawn on busy Lenox Avenue, others were left propped against lampposts. It was said that on one body Bumpy pinned a note that read, "Harlem returned to sender," though that detail entered into underworld lore and may be apocryphal. What is documented is that the Amsterdam News reported black operators were girding for open and violent warfare against the white syndicate invading their neighborhood. Harlem's long simmering resentment at outside oppression had found an avatar in Bumpy Johnson. Dutch Schultz was furious and unnerved. None of his previous foes had fought back quite like this. From his point of view, this should have been a simple racket takeover. But instead of crumbling, St. Clair remained at large, and now she had this bold young lieutenant making Dutch's life hell. To make matters worse for Schultz, around the same time he was battling legal troubles. In mid-1933, Thomas Dewey's office had indicted Schultz for income tax evasion. Though he managed to wriggle off the hook in a first trial, Dewey came at him again with new charges. Dutch had to run. He shifted between safe houses in New Jersey and upstate, directing his Harlem operations from afar to avoid arrest. The once swaggering king of the rackets was now often in hiding, which only made him more irritable and violent when he communicated orders to his men. His paranoia grew, and loyalty within his crew was stretched thin. Dutch's habit of quick, brutal punishment for perceived failure won him obedience, but not genuine devotion. Desperate to eliminate St. Clair and Bumpy so he could focus on his legal woes, Schultz escalated his tactics. If gunmen couldn't easily catch the slippery Madame Queen, maybe Guile could. Dutch enlisted one of his own, a man named Max Fatty Reen, to hatch a murder plot against Stephanie St. Clair. Reen reached out to a close friend of St. Clair's named Catherine S. Cat Odlum, figuring he could either bribe or scare her into betraying the Queen. He offered Odlum $500, a small fortune, in 1934, to lure St. Clair to a meeting where Schultz's knife-wielding assassins would be waiting. If she refused the bribe, the threat was clear: cooperate or face lethal consequences. It was a cunning plan, leveraging someone St. Clair trusted. But Dutch made one mistake: he underestimated Catherine Odlum's loyalty. Instead of playing Judas, Odlum immediately told St. Clair everything, even signing an affidavit swearing that a mobster had approached her to set up St. Clair's murder. St. Clair and Odlum decided to beat Schultz at his own game by using the system against him. They publicized the plot, marching straight into a courthouse to demand protection. In a dramatic scene, the pair stormed into the Washington Heights court and implored Judge Louis Brodsky to issue an arrest warrant for Max Reen. Newspapers covered the spectacle too well, dressed black women asking the law to intervene against gangland scheming. Judge Brodsky, citing lack of jurisdiction or evidence, refused to issue the warrant. St. Clair was incensed as she left the courtroom. She made sure reporters heard her parting shot. "That's why there's so much crime in these United States," she exclaimed loudly. The press ate it up, framing it as the sassy queen of Harlem openly shaming the justice system. Schultz, of course, was livid that his quiet murder plot became front-page news. Not only had St. Clair slipped away again, but now her accusations were giving ammunition to prosecutor Dewey. Every headline tying Schultz's name to violence in Harlem only strengthened Dewey's case that Dutch was a public menace. And perhaps worst of all for Schultz's ego, Stephanie St. Clair, a woman and a black woman, at that was publicly thumbing her nose at him, saying she wasn't afraid. Indeed, she had told one reporter, "I'm not afraid of Dutch Schultz or any other living man. If I find Schultz in Harlem, I'll blast him out. The policy game is my game. He took it away from me and is swindling the colored people." Such bold words in print only made Schultz more determined to eliminate her. The underworld buzzed with the intensity of this black-white gang war. By mid-1935, it was clear Harlem had become a battlefield every bit as violent as Chicago during Prohibition. Estimates in the press and police reports suggested that at least 40 people had been killed in the struggle for Harlem's numbers rackets. The tally of bodies included black and white, mobsters and bystanders. Schultz's gunmen murdered numbers operators who wouldn't give in. Bumpy's men killed Schultz's henchmen whenever they could catch them alone, and innocent people sometimes got caught in the crossfire. In one tragic episode, Schultz's imported enforcer Ulysses Rollins, a hitman from Chicago whom Dutch hired to handle. Bumpy Johnson chased Bumpy through the streets and fired wildly, missing Bumpy but accidentally killing a black woman passerby. Rollins was promptly arrested by an off-duty cop after that blunder, and though he was one of Dutch's best, he was never seen in Harlem again. Out of the picture for good. The confrontation with Ulysses Rollins had been yet another dramatic chapter of the war. Rollins arrived in Harlem in the summer of 1935. A tough gunman brought in after Schultz's previous enforcer, the towering Bub Hewlett, was jailed on an unrelated charge. Hewlett himself was an interesting figure, a Harlem native, who ironically had once built a reputation throwing white mobsters out of Harlem, but then switched sides to work for Schultz when the money got good. St. Clair had cursed Hewlett as a traitor to his race and community. Now with Hewlett sidelined, Schultz pinned hopes on Rollins, but Bumpy Johnson was ready. One evening, Bumpy was on a date at the elegant Alhambra Ballroom and Theater on 126th Street, sharing a meal with a Vanity Fair editor, when he spotted Ulysses Rollins entering the establishment. Bumpy excused himself politely, walked over to Rollins with an eerily calm demeanor, and without warning slashed the gangster across the face and chest with his knife. Rollins hit the floor, bleeding and stunned by the lightning attack. Bumpy coolly stepped over the writhing man, returned to his table, and in a display of almost comical nonchalance, told his date he suddenly had a craving for spaghetti and meatballs. The message was clear: Harlem was his territory, and even Schultz's imported killers would get cut down literally if they showed their faces. Rollins survived the knife wounds and, nursing his pride, sought vengeance not long after. He tracked Bumpy to a little restaurant on 125th Street called Frank's. Bursting in, Rollins opened fire at Bumpy but missed. A bullet struck a woman patron instead, killing her instantly. An off-duty police officer dining nearby drew his weapon and bravely arrested Rollins on the spot. With that, another of Schultz's best men was removed from the board. By then, Dutch's Harlem crew must have felt cursed. Every move they made seemed to backfire. By the autumn of 1935, Dutch Schultz's grand designs on Harlem were crumbling. He still held portions of the racket, but controlling it was costing more than it was worth. Stephanie St. Clair, though battered, had survived. Bumpy Johnson had become an underground hero for effectively waging a guerrilla war that drove Schultz out of Harlem, at least physically. In one major coup, St. Clair and Bumpy got wind of the location of Schultz's main clearinghouse for policy bets, the central counting office where millions of dollars in bets were tallied each week. St. Clair secretly passed this information to the handful of honest policemen she knew. The result was a dramatic police raid on an upscale apartment at 550 West 146th Street, where officers seized 10 million betting slips, evidence of Schultz's massive operation, and arrested 14 of his employees. They even found tin boxes stuffed with cash. The raid decapitated Schultz's Harlem operations. Panicked, Dutch had the clearinghouse relocated outside the city. For the first time in years, the Dutchman wasn't physically present in Harlem at all. He was a remote occupier, his influence slipping. Emboldened by these small victories, Harlem's remaining independent bankers took a page from St. Clair's activist playbook. They formed a coalition, essentially a mini-union of policy operators, to stand against the outside mob. In an Amsterdam News interview, an unnamed black policy banker revealed that after an 8-week recruitment campaign, most of the holdout bankers banded together, representing about 100 employees. They printed 75,000 pamphlets urging Harlemites to bet only with black-run banks, declaring that the numbers game is a Negro game in a Negro neighborhood. This was community pride harnessed against organized crime, a remarkable show of unity among people who were, paradoxically, criminals themselves under the law, yet saw themselves as defenders of Harlem's economic self-determination. Even many ordinary citizens supported this cause, betting with the home team, rather than the interlopers, became a quiet form of resistance. Behind the scenes, however, a significant shift was happening that would change the balance of power. Bumpy Johnson, ever pragmatic, sensed that Dutch Schultz was on a sinking ship. Schultz's reckless violence and defiance of the law had made him a marked man far beyond Harlem. Thomas Dewey was closing in relentlessly, and more importantly, other crime bosses in New York were growing wary of Schultz's antics, especially his talk about assassinating Dewey, which they viewed as courting disaster. Bumpy had no love for the Italian Mafia, but he recognized their influence, so he quietly reached out to Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the most powerful mob boss in New York, head of what would later be called the Genovese crime family. In mid-1935, Bumpy began negotiations with Lucky Luciano for a suitable arrangement. As one account phrased it, what kind of arrangement? Essentially, Bumpy was ready to concede a piece of the pie to the Italian syndicate in exchange for peace and a share of control. Lucky Luciano was shrewd. He knew Schultz's days might be numbered, and he was happy to cultivate an alliance with Harlem's black operators. The outlines of the deal, later finalized after Schultz was gone, were that Lucky's organization would take over Schultz's interests in Harlem. But the independent bankers who had fought back, those loyal to Bumpy and St. Clair, would be allowed to continue running their games independently, so long as they paid a tax or tribute to the Mafia. In effect, Harlem's numbers would become part of the Luciano crime family's empire. But Bumpy Johnson would act as the liaison or intermediary, making sure the Italians got their cut and that the community's interests were protected. It wasn't exactly the victory Madame St. Clair had envisioned when she vowed never to bow to outside mobsters. In fact, she felt deeply betrayed when she learned Bumpy was cutting deals with Luciano. From her perspective, the war had been about maintaining complete independence. But Bumpy saw the writing on the wall. Harlem could never be completely free of the larger underworld forces, so the best outcome was a compromise that preserved some autonomy and stopped the bloodshed. In late October 1935, events suddenly accelerated. Dutch Schultz, cornered by law enforcement and disobeying the Mafia's warnings, made a fateful move. He insisted on going after Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor determined to put him behind bars. The Mafia Commission, led by Luciano, had expressly forbidden any hit on Dewey, fearing the fallout of murdering a high-profile lawman. Schultz furiously yelled that if they wouldn't sanction it, he'd do it anyway. That was the final straw. The commission ordered a hit on Dutch Schultz. On the evening of October 23, 1935, a squad of Mafia gunmen, including the infamous Charlie Bug workmen, tracked Schultz to the Palace Chophouse restaurant in Newark, New Jersey. As Dutch sat in the restroom, they opened fire with a rapid volley of shots. Schultz staggered out mortally wounded, hit in the abdomen. His trusted lieutenants, including bodyguard Lulu Rosenkrantz and bookkeeper Abadaba Berman, were likewise gunned down that night, 2 dying on the spot. Dutch clung to life for almost a full day, delirious from fever and peritonitis in a hospital bed. In his delirium, he rambled incoherently. His famous last words became a subject of morbid fascination for the press, a stream of nonsense about bankrolls and imaginary conversations. But amid the chaos of his final hours, one message cut through clearly. Stephanie St. Clair, upon hearing that Schultz was not yet dead, sent a Western Union telegram to his hospital room. It read, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." It was a biblical pronouncement of Justice Galatians 6 and 7, signed, pointedly, Madame Queen of Policy. The man who had tried to destroy her lay gut shot and dying, and she made sure he received her last word. Shortly after, in the early hours of October 24, 1935, Arthur, Dutch Schultz, died of his wounds at age 34. The Harlem Gang War, at least the phase led by Dutch, was effectively over. With Schultz gone, the immediate threat to Harlem's numbers bankers evaporated. There would be no more drive-by shootings from his crew, no more kidnappings or intimidation. His entire operation collapsed overnight. But Harlem's victory was bittersweet. Control of the numbers game now passed not back into solely black hands, but to the Italian Mafia under Lucky Luciano. True to his word, Luciano moved swiftly to claim Schultz's former dominion. However, he honored the understanding he'd reached with Bumpy Johnson. Lucky recognized that outright terrorizing Harlem had proved costly for Schultz. A smarter approach was to partner Sexton in unequal measure with a local figure. He installed Bumpy Johnson as the de facto Italian mob's representative in Harlem, the liaison, and controller of the neighborhood on their behalf. In practice, this meant Bumpy was given authority to run the day-to-day numbers rackets in Harlem, settle disputes, and keep the business flowing so long as the agreed percentage of profits made its way downtown to the Mafia bosses. Those Harlem bankers who had fought for independence were allowed to keep operating. Madame St. Clair herself, by this point, had essentially retired from the racket, having possibly made a private deal to surrender her enterprise before Schultz's death. For many black Harlemites, the fact that Bumpy Johnson, a black man, could negotiate with the mighty Italian Mafia and come away with a deal was a point of pride. As the Harlem World magazine later noted, that deal in 1935 made Johnson an instant hero in the eyes of many Harlemites, who were impressed that a black man could actually cut deals with the Italian Mafia. Bumpy's stature skyrocketed. In the aftermath, Bumpy Johnson became known as the Harlem Godfather, the uncrowned king of Harlem's underworld. Johnson was soon the toast of Harlem. One historical profile writes, mingling with celebrities and legends of the neighborhood. Indeed, in the late 1930s and 40s, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson would socialize with the likes of Billie Holiday, Duke Ellington, Lena Horne, boxer Sugar Ray Robinson, and other luminaries. He was a paradoxical figure, at once a revered community benefactor and a feared mob boss. The Italian mob was content as long as profits rolled in, and the Harlem numbers indeed continued to generate millions, with a cut now flowing to Luciano's family, later the Genovese family. No one could conduct any significant criminal activity in Harlem without Bumpy's permission. He had earned that clout in blood. And what of Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the erstwhile numbers queen who had ignited this fight? Not one to be overshadowed, St. Clair remained a prominent public figure for a time. In 1936, she made headlines again by marrying Sevs in a non-legal ceremony the controversial activist Sufi Abdul Hamid, an alliance that soon went sour amid scandal and violence. In 1938, St. Clair even served prison time for shooting and merely wounding her cheating husband in a tempestuous incident. After her release, however, Madame St. Clair finally withdrew from the world of crime. She spent her later years quietly on Harlem's Sugar Hill, occasionally writing letters to newspaper editors about civil rights and racism. When Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in 1968, St. Clair was still around, and it's said that until her own death in 1969, she enjoyed the lasting protection of her old Lieutenant Bumpy, who never forgot what she had done for him in their early days. The Harlem Numbers War of the early 1930s stands as a remarkable saga in the annals of organized crime and in the history of black American resistance to oppression. It was a war in which a black woman and a black man dared to defy one of the era's most vicious gang lords. The violence was real. At least 40 lives were lost as this underground economy was battled over. People in Harlem in that era spoke of the conflict in the same breath as they did the notorious Chicago gang wars. Yet it was also a war of symbolism and pride. Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson framed their fight not merely as a turf dispute, but as a stand for their community's right to self-determination. The policy game is our game, St. Clair insisted, meaning Harlem's. When Bumpy Johnson risked his lifetime and again in shootouts and street brawls, he wasn't just protecting an illicit lottery racket. He was defending the principle that Harlem was not to be casually exploited by outside whites, whether gangsters or otherwise. In the end, the outcome was a compromise. Harlem's numbers game fell under external control, but through a deal that kept many black operators in place under Bumpy's oversight. Some might say Bumpy sold out by working with the Italian mob. Others would argue he salvaged what he could to ensure Harlem's community at least got a share and a measure of respect going forward. What's certain is that after 1935, no gang lord ever again tried to take Harlem in the way Schultz did. The Italian Mafia certainly profited from Harlem, but they did so with the cooperation of Harlem's own reigning figure, Bumpy, not over his dead body. Harlem itself changed too. The saga of Schultz versus Bumpy entered the folklore of the community. Decades later, elders would recount how Bumpy Johnson fought for Harlem, how he stared down Dutch Schultz and made the Bronx beer baron think twice about ever coming uptown again. Parents even told children fantastical, sounding tales of Bumpy's exploits the night he single-handedly defeated a dozen assassins, as we saw in that broad daylight shootout, or how he put the fear of God into a Ku Klux Klansman posse that once snuck into the city, another legend for another time. These stories sometimes blurred the line between fact and myth, but they all carried a kernel of truth. Bumpy Johnson had become a symbol of Harlem's defiance. In a poignant turn of history, years later in the 1960s, Bumpy Johnson served time at Alcatraz prison in California. During that stint, he received a visit from his old acquaintance, the great musician Duke Ellington, so the story goes. Duke asked him, "Why'd you do it, Bumpy? All that trouble back then, was it worth it?" Bumpy supposedly replied with a wry smile, "A gangster takes, a king protects." In that simple phrase, he captured what the fight against Dutch Schultz had meant to him, not just seizing territory, but defending his community's dignity. That night in Harlem, Bumpy said, perhaps referring to one of the legendary confrontations, "I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for Harlem, our people, our pride. Some kingdoms can't be conquered." Indeed, the outcome of the Harlem Numbers War proved that even the mightiest of outsiders could be humbled when a community stood behind its own. Dutch Schultz came to Harlem with an army, but in the end he was forced out by a combination of black resolve and his own hubris, leading to his downfall. Bumpy Johnson, the man who had removed dozens of Schultz's henchmen, in broad daylight, as the saying went, emerged not as a defeated victim but as a sort of folk hero. He had protected Harlem's honor in its darkest days. As a contemporary black newspaper would later reflect, the war against Schultz cost St. Clair and Bumpy dearly. St. Clair estimated it cost her $750,000 in lost business and legal fees, and not for a moment did they regret it. The legacy of those turbulent years is etched into Harlem's identity. In the very streets where blood once ran, you can almost hear the echoes of that defiant refrain, "Harlem ain't for sale." It was true in 1935, and it remains a proud truth in the history books. The story of Dutch Schultz versus Bumpy Johnson is more than a gangster tale. It's the story of a community that refused to be conquered, of unlikely leaders rising in a crucible of crisis, and of an American neighborhood staking its claim to self-respect amid chaos. Harlem had drawn a line in the sand, and by the time the dust settled, Dutch Schultz learned a lesson he might have read in the Bible, but failed to heed until it was too late. As you sow, so shall you reap. And in sowing violence and greed in Harlem, Schultz reaped defeat at the hands of those he thought he could intimidate. The King of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson, had risen, and an entire community stood taller because of it.